This is an editorial that Richard Dawkins wrote in Nature in 1981. And it's called Selfish Genes in Race and Politics. And the editorial was denouncing the National Front in Britain because they had picked up this idea of selfish genes, and in an article called, a journal called New Nation, and basically said, yes, nationalism is natural. It comes right out of our genes. Sociobiology says this. So the British National Front is correct in what it's arguing. And this was scary enough that Richard Dawkins denounced this in Nature, which is the leading biology journal probably in the whole world, but certainly in Britain. And he said, no, the National Front have got it wrong. They've misunderstood selfish gene theory. They've misunderstood Richard Dawkins. They've misunderstood William Hamilton. And his reasoning went like this. If you give 50% of your genes to your child, 25% to your grandchild, 12.5% to the next generation, 6.5% after that, 3% after that, 1.5% after that, well, it's vanishingly, your genes vanish very quickly. 6 or 7 generations and they're gone. There is no way to keep your immortality of genes going forward. And that's the mathematics of William Hamilton's theory. And he even used the analogy of Queen Elizabeth II of Britain not sharing any genes of her great-great-great-great ancestor, William the Conqueror, who conquered England in 1066. Even though she's a direct descendant, he said, there's no genes in common. Well, it convinced a lot of people, and on the pure mathematics of William Hamilton's theory, he was correct. But I and other people basically argued that this is much too narrow a perspective. If we go to the next slide, I'm not sure it's... Oh, yeah. So in 1984, about 3 or 4 years later, I published a paper called Genetic Similarity Theory, which essentially argued that if a gene can recognize a copy of itself in others, in a kin, then it can recognize a copy of itself in non-kin. All you have to do is recognize a copy of the same gene. And so altruism could be much more broadly defined than just within the kin group. And so I called it genetic similarity theory in order to differentiate it from kin selection theory. By 1989, which is the cover of the paper that I'm showing you there, we had actually carried out several studies to show that at least people were, in effect, recognizing copies of their genes in others. If we go to the next slide. This is a bar graph. This is assortative mating of not just spouses, but also best friends. If you look at physical characteristics, people are picking each other on similarity. But the interesting point is that they pick each other more on the more heritable of those characteristics. If you look at your wrist is very heritable. It's about 80% heritable. If you look at your waist, it too is heritable, but it's only about 40% heritable. If you look at your thigh, it also is heritable, but it's about 60% heritable. So some of these characteristics are much more modifiable by what exercise regimes you are on, what food you eat, and so on, whereas other things like the length of your earlobe, the distance between your eyes, the width of your nose, these are much more heritable. And it turns out that spouses and best friends are picking each other more on those most heritable characteristics. Now, I don't think that it's true that I don't know what the mechanisms are that people sit there and look at each other's earlobes and say, yes, this is the mate for me. It's all being done unconsciously somehow. But it shows, at least on physical characteristics, it's heritability, not culture. And notice that this is a differential prediction. This is a prediction, this pattern, from genetic theory. Culture theory predicts the opposite. Culture theory predicts something quite different. It says people will grow to be like each other as a result of social activities. So if you're couch potatoes, then you're going to develop a certain different type of body than if you're bicyclists. And so it's the activities that make people the same. So it would predict that those physical characteristics which are most modifiable should be the ones that spouses assort most on. And they're not. So in science, when you can pit two alternative theories against each other and make diametrically opposite predictions, and one's supported and the other's falsified, then that really is a strong piece of evidence. But you might say, well, maybe that's just something about these physical characteristics. So let's go to the next slide. This is personality. This is personality. Some traits are more heritable than others. If you have a dimension of anxiety, sport parachuting, do you enjoy sport parachuting, would be a good item to measure how anxious you are. It has a very, very high heritability. If I asked you, would being in debt worry you? That also is a good indicator of anxiety disposition, but it has a much lower heritability. So some items of personality are more heritable than others. If you look at the bar chart again, we find that spouses and best friends are most similar on the more heritable items. Go to the next one. Cognitive traits. Even IQ tests, if you have 60 or 80 items on an IQ test, some of those items are more genetically penetrated than others. Once again, spouses pick each other on the basis of the more genetically influenced items. Next one. Social attitudes. It's surprising to some people that even social attitudes have a heritable component. It's genes that make you incline you towards wanting to hug criminals or castrate them. Maybe it's a punitiveness, I don't know, but makes you choose Rottweilers rather than some other kind of dog. So it's a